everyone, and welcome back to the George Collection. I'm Rachel Rightside Blonde. Last week I took a little break from the George Collection to prepare for, now you know where I was going, the New York City rally at Madison Square Garden. As soon as he announced he was going to be speaking there, I just felt this strong calling that I needed to be there. And all I can say is, wow. It was absolutely an amazing rally. I saw people of all different races and religions in one building, all wanting the same thing, which is unity. And everything the mainstream media says about that rally is they couldn't have gotten it more wrong. It was a night I know I will never forget, and it's a night I'm sure I'm going to tell my kids and my grandkids about someday. And I took a lot of pictures, I took a lot of videos, and I hope some of you saw those on my social media and you enjoyed. This is the last George Collection that will air before the election. And this is a huge election. This, in my opinion, is probably the biggest election in history. And I wanted to bring attention to something that Donald Trump talks about a lot, which is Abraham Lincoln. It's no secret that he's compared himself to Abraham Lincoln, and in a lot of ways, I can see why.
Yet both of these men won in surprise elections and entered the White House at a time of deep division. Are there more parallels between Lincoln and Trump than you might think? Tell us what the reality was for Lincoln and running for president the first time.
Well, I mean, the divisiveness between blue states and gray states, as they soon became, was a lot tenser and a lot more pronounced than even between blue states and red states. So as you might expect, the entire South voted against Lincoln. In fact, his name wasn't even on the ballot in a number of deep South states. And in the end, while he won the electoral majority, he only won 39.9% of the popular vote. And I think that's still the lowest total of any winner in a presidential election, at least the last 200 years of presidential elections. So obviously there were people there who would not recognize the result, and they didn't.
We've heard so much being made of the fact that Donald Trump, as a campaigner, essentially created a means of going around the press. Almost saying to them, not quite, I don't need you. You know, I can tweet, I can get my messages out there, and I'm fine with that. Talk about Abraham Lincoln and his relationship with the press.
Well, at the beginning, it was very conventional. But at the time, the press was entirely, openly, proudly partisan. So there were Republican newspapers and Democratic newspapers. Where he begins to do more manipulation and more going around the established press culture of the day was as president, when he devised this fascinating new means of communication. And it is very much like Twitter, because it was just as daring and unconventional as Twitter. He called it the public letter. He would write a letter to a political opponent or a journalist, a governor, and he would give the letter not only to its recipient, but to a newspaper. One newspaper would publish it, and then the next day, every newspaper would publish it, usually on the front page. And in this way, Lincoln communicated directly with the people on really crucial and controversial issues.
Let me ask you about something else. We've seen some, I think it's fair to say, some real animosity between President Trump and some members of the media. Let's go back to Lincoln's time. And during the course of the Civil War, and as you said, the suspension of certain liberties, civil liberties, how about some animosity between Lincoln and the press during that era?
President Trump has a long way to go before he gets to the point that Lincoln was at with the press. He locked up journalists. In the earlier days of the war, after newspapers, Democratic newspapers in New York City began discouraging recruits from enlisting in the army, saying we should just let those southern states go, Lincoln, through the Secretary of State and the Postmaster General, prevented newspapers from going through the mails, had them seized from trains, ultimately locked up editors and closed down newspapers. Some of them never reopened. Now, they were pretty viciously racist newspapers, but Lincoln abrogated freedom of the press completely. And the other parallel, Jack, if I could just add one thing,
sure.
The shock that we all have about the notion of fake news. Abraham Lincoln was a master of fake news. In the run-up to emancipation in 1862, he wrote several openly disingenuous public letters saying whatever he did about emancipation, he would do only to save the Union. And if he could save the Union, he without freeing any slaves, he would happily do so. That was published, but what made it disingenuous was that Lincoln had already written the Emancipation Proclamation. He'd already told his cabinet that he was waiting only for a Union military victory in order to make it public. What he was doing was, in a sense, using fake news to set the stage for what he knew would be a controversial policy. So none of this is new. I'm sure there are examples in colonial times as well.
Prior to this episode, I was thinking about which magazine I wanted to highlight, and I thought, I'm going to highlight magazine 18. 18 in gematria is R. It's also the magazine after the issue when Michael Berman left. So Michael Berman left, and JFK Jr.'s name appeared alone in issue 17. This is issue 18. And on my way home from New York City, I thought, I'm going to highlight issue 18, not realizing that on issue 18, which is R, it's Abraham Lincoln. What a perfect segue into the election, comparing DJT to Abraham Lincoln. In looking at the cover of this, first of all, we see Harrison Ford dressed up as Abraham Lincoln. Interesting that his last name is Ford, and Abraham Lincoln got shot in Ford's Theater. I had the opportunity to walk by Ford's Theater last year when I was in Washington, D.C., and also the house where he eventually died. Now, I don't know why, but growing up, my father really was interested in Abraham Lincoln. He watched all the PBS shows about Abraham Lincoln, so naturally, I became interested in Abraham Lincoln. So I feel like I've grown up knowing a lot about Abraham Lincoln and what he overcame, and it's just interesting now to look back at what Abraham Lincoln was able to accomplish, and really, they do have quite a bit in common. Of course, the mainstream media will disagree all day long. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. He wrote the Emancipation Proclamation that went into effect in 1863, and slaves were freed in the southern states. Now looking back and seeing what Donald Trump has gone through with his presidency, it makes me wonder if there were elements of destabilization going on back in the Civil War days. And I think for the most part, all of us want unity. Nobody wants a civil war. Nobody wants to fight with their neighbors. But there's this push from somewhere that it just keeps building. It certainly seems as if Donald Trump is trying to quell a civil war. We have half the country who can see what's going on and see that we are modern day slaves. You go on X on any day, and there's attacks from the left onto him. And they're not just attacks like, I'm going to say my opinion. They're attacks like, this person is dangerous, this person needs to be taken out. What's dangerous is what they're calling for. This issue of George is called the passion issue, which is quite fitting, because I don't think there's anyone who has more passion for this country than Donald J. Trump, and I think he's proven that. He had a really good life. He could have gone off into the sunset, retired on a beach somewhere, and spent the days with his grandkids and his family, but he didn't. He fought for our country. He gave all of that up to take all of these daggers for us. And essentially, he woke up a sleeping nation to the truth of our reality. He's independently wealthy. He didn't need the lobbyists' money to do what he needed to do. He has the interest of the American people at heart, and that's the truth. And so did Abraham Lincoln. All people, blacks, whites, everyone. By now, most of you have seen the uncanny parallels between Abraham Lincoln and John Kennedy in terms of their assassinations and how they were killed.
Abraham Lincoln was shot in the back of the head on April 14, 1865, by John Wilkes Booth. This happened while he was attending a play in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. John F. Kennedy was shot in the head with a sniper by Lee Harvey Oswald while taking part in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas on November 22, 1963. Both men died within 24 hours of being shot, and power went to their vice presidents. When Lincoln died, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, took power, and when Kennedy died, his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, took power. Abraham Lincoln was elected into Congress in 1846 and elected president in 1860. John F. Kennedy was elected into Congress in 1946 and elected president in 1960. Both Lincoln and Kennedy had a son who died while they were in the White House. Abraham Lincoln's son, William, died of typhoid in 1862 at the age of 11. John F. Kennedy's son, Patrick, died just 2 days after being born. Both Lincoln and Kennedy's wives were present at the time of their assassination. Now let's look at the two assassins, Booth and Oswald. John Wilkes Booth was born in 1839 and went by 3 names with a total of 15 letters. Lee Harvey Oswald was born in 1939 and went by 3 names with a total of 15 letters as well. Both Lincoln and Kennedy were shot in the head on a Friday. Both Lincoln and Kennedy's assassins were shot before they could be tried and questioned. How handy for the CIA. Lincoln and Kennedy also both have 7 letters. And finally, Kennedy was shot in a Lincoln brand car.
It's almost become a playbook of what happens if you go against the status quo. And just for the record, the only presidents that were ever featured on the covers of George were President Nixon, President Kennedy, and President Reagan. Later on, after John's plane went down, there was a cover with Al Gore and George Bush, but they were as characters. They weren't an actual picture. So the only presidents that were shown were Nixon, Reagan, and Kennedy. Very interesting. So what does this all mean? It means we all have the chance to cast our vote for someone who is going to be for freedom, for us, for the people. We have the chance to vote for someone who has our best interests at heart. We have the chance to vote for someone who is going to unify our country. And someday, hopefully soon, when the credits run, we can look back and we can say that we voted for true freedom, not this manufactured freedom that we've been sold for years. And one final thought about Abraham Lincoln. Let's think about his most favorite speech. It starts with 47 years ago. 47. Who's going to be our 47th president? Donald J. Trump. That does it for this episode of the George Collection. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time.
Of this extraordinary magazine, George, which is a hoot of a magazine. I thought you were a lawyer.
I was.
What happened?
Well, we decided, actually taking cue from folks like yourself and you around the 1992 election, that there was an opportunity here to change the definition of a political magazine. Certainly the way Americans were accessing information about politics and politicians was changing. Candidates were appearing on late night talk shows, on talk radio, on sitcoms, and there was a kind of a leveling process, and while the rest of media clearly had caught up with that, we felt that political magazines per se hadn't.
Your mother was a hell of an editor at Doubleday.
That's what I hear.
Would she have liked George?
I think she would have.